Greetings, friends.
My name is Steve Kelsey.
And I'm Ron Leota, and this is The Roles We Play, the show about the roles we play in the games we love. On the show today, we are having nostalgia goggles again, Heir to the Throne. We are discussing spiritual successors. Without further ado, let's start the show. All right, so last week we talked a little bit about, well, 2 weeks ago, I suppose, we talked about the age of bringing it back. I still want to focus a bit on these nostalgia goggles we all got on recently, but right now I want to talk more about like Heir to the Throne, the spiritual successor games, the amazing projects like Bloodstained, and the very much not so amazing projects like the ill-fated Mighty Number 9.
I literally have both of those in my notes to talk about, so I'm glad we're in the same exact headspace for it. I really want to just like troll the users, and really start this episode talking off about Square Enix again, because troll the audience with it, because of course that's where my mind's at with Final Fantasy VII. So I need to do it, and so I need to bring this up before I forget it, because it's to me it's one of the most like blatant and obvious paths to why spiritual successors can happen, and also something that I don't see a lot of people bringing up to. So in the last episode 2 weeks ago, when we totally recorded this 2 weeks ago and not just like 20 minutes ago, last episode, I feel like the audience knows if they watch the videos, we're in the same outfits every 2 episodes. We talked a lot about Square Enix, and one of the things we talked about was Final Fantasy X and how good it was, and I kind of offhandedly mentioned that it kind of changed after that, and a lot of that had to do with the president leaving the company and taking some of the senior developers with him, and starting a studio that released 2 games kind of roughly near each other. Blue Dragon, which felt like this was in the Xbox 360 era. Blue Dragon, which felt a bit more like an Enix game, a lot more like Dragon Quest, and Lost Odyssey.
Very Dragon Questy.
And then Lost Odyssey. And the reason I say Lost Odyssey specifically is there's been many phenomenal Dragon Quest games that are pretty flawless since he left, and that was always Enix's baby. But Lost Odyssey is the Final Fantasy 11 proper series, not the MMO, but like would have been Final Fantasy 11. It feels like a Final Fantasy game. It plays like a Final Fantasy game. Nobuo Uematsu does the soundtrack, so it sounds like a Final Fantasy game. It is the spiritual successor, but it makes sense because the person that had basically made Final Fantasy what it was over essentially 2-ish decades, about 18 years, was in charge of it. So it made sense, and that's why that, to me, even though Final Fantasy has gone on to see many sequels, is the spiritual successor of the first, like, 10 main games of Final Fantasy. And so I needed to bring that up if we were talking about spiritual successors, but we might as well go into listicle mode. What are some spiritual successors that you can think of off the top of your head, Ron?
So going from the early, I'll go from the two of the earlier ones for me. The first is the first spiritual successor I know I played, but I was unaware of even the term spiritual successor at the time, and that was Perfect Dark. Perfect Dark was absolutely a spiritual successor to the GoldenEye series.
Oh, absolutely.
But I think the first one I played where I was fully aware this is absolutely a spiritual successor to a game was BioShock. Because System Shock 2, whereas a very famous cult classic game, not a lot of people these days, and particularly people who are fans of BioShock, ever had the experience of playing System Shock 2 back in the day. So I'm not sure a lot of people were aware that those games were connected. I know fans did, but I don't know that people just walking into BioShock know that connection.
No, I don't think most people knew. I didn't know when I'd first bought BioShock, but I learned about it after reading up a bit about it when I was stuck in an area of the game. And so Yeah, BioShock is absolutely System Shock 2's follow-up sequel as far as what the developer wanted to do with it, and it makes sense. It's I would say BioShock is now, in a modern day of YouTube and video game journalism, sort of like almost the most famous spiritual successor, because it's different enough from System Shock 2 to really be not a clearly this is just an unnamed sequel to it, whereas it's so the same of it, and it so directly leads into BioShock in so many ways that it writes that perfect line of being like a direct sequel and a spiritual successor at the same time, and it works really, really well. And again, it's business reasons for why that happened, right? Like that's pure business reasons and nothing else. Would have been
Well, yeah, because I mean, like you have like Demon Souls, which some people will claim is a spiritual successor to Dark Souls, but I mean, everybody views that as just the Souls series. And that's the reason they use the term the Souls series, because they came out sequentially enough that I don't think it had time to really what I would call Dark Souls as the spiritual successor to a game where it's just like this, and this is a sequel, right?
This is just a less good version of Dark Souls that like set the tone for it, and then there were a lot of improvements that happened. One of my favorite spiritual successors, because they are all sequels, but they're not really sequels. But they are sequels, and I love the ones that kind of ride that line. They're all made by the same studio, but they're all very different games. Is everything Team Ico has released since Ico, where it's like, yeah, Shadow of Colossus doesn't play like Ico exactly, but it's pretty much a sequel. It's in the same universe. It's a prequel, technically. But, and then it's like, Last Guardian isn't either of these games, really, but it's pretty much these games. And so it's a real fun way where the studio's kind of deliberately not making them Ico 2 and Ico 3, but they are Ico 2 and Ico 3. But if you break them down like gameplay-wise and story-wise, they're a mood spiritual successor. Like, they have some of the similar puzzle elements, but they are mood spiritual successors, which I think is really neat when a studio does that. And they're like, this isn't like we couldn't have done it. We just decided to kind of make games sort of in this realm that are very lightly tied together, but they're not there as a direct sequel like a Call of Duty or like a Doom Eternal or like a Uncharted, right? Where it's like 4 Uncharted games are all direct sequels and are supposed to be that. And then Last of Us is not like those games, even though it kind of is, but for the most part, it's a very different feel of the game.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think there's games that come out that are very much trying to be spiritual successors for series that are still selling. Maybe not super successful, but are still selling or are still around. And that always strikes me as a little bit weird. I've always viewed like spiritual successors more, they just aren't making this game anymore. Or the version they're making is so far away from what the original game was. Like you get, they made some Castlevania games within recent memory, but those were weird God of War with like some Zelda elements, but you get something like I mentioned at the beginning, Bloodstained, which, and I'll just say it right now because I'm going to mention it a lot. Bloodstained, by far one of my favorite spiritual successor games ever. I love it.
It's great.
Don't try to remake Symphony of the Night again because they already did it and it's good. Every time I see any other Kickstarter game being like, oh, the game Symphony of the Night fans have always wanted, and I'm like, oh, you poor bastard.
We already got that game. We already got it, and it was called Bloodstained, and it's a fucking perfect game. So I've got a double question for you. Number one, would you consider Outer Worlds a spiritual successor to Fallout?
I would consider Outer Worlds a spiritual successor specifically to Fallout New Vegas.
Yeah, and then second question, would you consider Fallout 3 a spiritual successor to Fallout 1 and 2 since it is such a different game but still in the same universe?
Ooh.
Because I like getting into what is and isn't, or what are different categories of what you would call spirit. Like you mentioned with Castlevania, it's perfect lead into this, which is that Bloodstained is a spiritual successor to Symphony of the Night and a lot of the advanced and DS Castlevanias back. And you know, back to the Nintendo, back to the Game Boy Advance and the DS. And it's a spiritual successor to the 2D Castlevania games. But there were still Castlevania games. Fallout 1 and 2 happened, and then there was not going to be any more Fallout. And then Bethesda sort of picked it up and ran with it and changed a lot of it. But it's still very much in that Fallout world. So much so that Bethesda realized they should just reach out to the studio that made it. That had a lot of the people that made it. And we're like, could you also make a Fallout? And whereas New Vegas is absolutely, I would argue, more in perfect tone pitch to 1 and 2 because it's made by the same people. I think Fallout 3 is still very much tied into that, more so than Fallout 4 and 1,000% more so than 76. Still very much kind of tied into that a little bit more. So I don't know where to put those on the line. And then the fact that Outer Worlds came out after Fallout 76, made by the studio that made Fallout New Vegas, which is more like Fallout 1 and 2, like all of it is very jumbled and complicated by comparison to most spiritual successor games, where it's like, this franchise either really went away from what they were originally doing, or these games just don't get made anymore.
Yeah, and that's a hard one because, I mean, it's still technically a role-playing game. It's still in that genre. It's still in the same world. They own the rights to the real name. You can call it Fallout. They have all the specific Fallout terminology in the game. They tell a story very much like they tell a story in the early Fallout games, just maybe with a not as wide of a scope, especially with Fallout 3. But, like, I mean, yeah, if you wanna look at it in that way, it's like it may be a sequel, but it is a definitively different game. It's definitely Wasteland to me felt like the Wasteland series to me feels more like Fallout 1 and 2, and I would lump those all into one category versus what I would consider Fallout 3. Fallout 3 to me is, you know, taking the Elder Scrolls formula and putting Fallout on it.
I think that's true. I think that's fair. But it does bring up the question: is like, is there spiritual successors that does it have to be the same game mechanic to be a spiritual successor kind of thing, or like rooted in the same game mechanics, or is it okay for it to be basically in a similar game world and have kind of a similar tone, but then change the mechanic? And the way I fell on it is that it's like that isn't really a spiritual successor because gameplay is such an important part of what makes a game a game. That's why System Shock 2 and BioShock work, is because they're very different in the way that like the time frames they're set in and the attitude and tone of the world that they're in like, you know, genre of science fiction versus sort of like a sci-fi fantasy retro thing that BioShock and 1 and 2 and Infinite bring. So that's that. Yeah, to me, that's why I want to talk about the bad one. That's why Mighty Number 9 is a spiritual successor to Mega Man, even though it's a bad one, which is real sad because it should have been good and it just wasn't. Even though Mega Man 9 and 10 had released within 10, I think had released within like 4 or 5 years of Mighty Number 9 coming out.
I mean, just let me vent just a tiny bit of rage on this one, man. Like, I kickstarted that thing. I was so stoked for that thing. I am a diehard Mega Man fan. And I was looking so forward to a modernized Mega Man. And the early screenshots, the early stuff they had looked really promising. And when they released it, it made me so mad. I didn't kickstart another video game for years. I was like, I'm not gonna. No, you broke my heart. You broke crowdfunding for me.
That's why I'd say like, what are the games? Pillars of Eternity and Divinity: Original Sin to me feel like spiritual successors to Baldur's Gate Neverwinter. more than the games that those studios had released in the interim or since. Because they feel mechanically a lot more like the evolution of those game styles versus, say, Dragon Age, obviously, when it comes to Neverwinter. Dragon Age Origins very much felt like a continuation to Baldur's Gate, like a really good, like, it's like, oh, look what we can do now with this. But Dragon Age 2 and Dragon Age, the third one, the Inquisition, both of those were much more of a different hack and slashier, actionier, bigger open worldier RPG. This does bring up something, though. So the reason I was excited for Mighty Number 9 is because, of course, original game design lead was behind it, right? Like, you were like, oh, this has old school flavor. And so it brings me to the next question, which is, do you think that a spiritual successor needs to have some of the classic team members to really make it work? And if it does, when does the ship of Theseus sort of thing come into play, where you've replaced enough planks in the wood? When does it stop becoming the ship that it was? Like, Obsidian and Black Isle are, very similar studios because they hold on to a lot of the staff. But if it has just one or two people that were important in the original series releasing a game to Kickstarter, does that mean that even if it's in the same style, should be seen as a spiritual successor? Or is it just like you can't really trust it to be one because it's not the same team that really put together? It's just a couple people from it.
I mean, it varies so much. I mean, like we saw with Mighty Number 9, you come to find out the guy putting it together didn't actually have as much to do with building Mega Man as was kind of like he was said as the Mega Man creator is coming back to bring back a new Mega Man. And I'm like, what? That kind of actually turned out to be not 100% true. He was involved, absolutely, and he was a big part of it, but he wasn't like what I would say the sole creator of Mega Man. And as we can see, even with somebody who is a big part of it from the early get-go, doesn't necessarily equal a good game. But you had Bloodstained, which did turn out to be awesome and had some of the very original people on it. What was it? I could be wrong on this one, but Yooka-Laylee had a lot of the Banjo and Kazooie team, right?
Yep.
And honestly, I know this one could be controversial. I thought Yooka-Laylee was awful.
It was not a good game. It was the magic wasn't there for that game. And I think that goes to show that just because a studio, even a studio with a lot of people that worked on something, is making a new game in a style of a game they haven't made in like 10 years, doesn't mean that studio knows how to make that game now or has the resources or inspiration to make it now. It's sort of like a band that gets back together after 10 years. You're sort of rolling the dice on if they can still musically work together, even if they're all the same musicians that worked together before. 10 years changes the mind creatively. And so
that happened with Duke Nukem. I mean, that was one of the many, 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 many huge legacy of foibles of Duke Nukem, was that early on when they were trying to develop the sequel, eventually it got to the point that the people working on it didn't know how to work with the modern technology.
Yeah.
They had only built games in the classic FPS engines and are now like being confronted with all this new tech that they didn't keep up on. And that was one of the many times Duke Nukem flopped and didn't get made, and then it kept pushed and pushed and pushed.
Yep, and it's kind of crazy. I definitely think that I have a problem also too, because spiritual successors implies that a game series is sort of over, and or that the thing that made the game series impactful is kind of over. That's why Souls type games aren't spiritual successors necessarily, or weren't at the time, because Dark Souls was still coming out with games, and they've since moved on, but they haven't moved on from that style of game exactly. So calling anything a Souls spiritual successor would be kind of weird at this point. just because it's like, well, that's not exactly the case. Those games aren't gone yet as far as from the studio that sort of invented them. And so doing that would be, I think, a little disingenuous at this point versus, say, a Castlevania or a Mega Man even. Funnily enough, and we keep hitting Mega Man, but it just like Mega Man's such an interesting property. So Capcom sort of spiritual successored Mega Man in like a reboot where they sort of just made it better in the Mega Man X series, almost in line with the sequel rhythm. Like, a lot of people appropriately lump all of Mega Man and Mega Man X together because they're very similar games, and they're pretty much made by the same studios that were, over time. But what's interesting about it is Mega Man X has like a lot of new shit to it and is a definite evolution and has a different play on the story. And so it kind of was the spiritual successor to the Mega Man series after they'd released Mega Man 6, but before I think 7 and 8 had even come out. So it was a weird thing that kind of happened. And then they stratified the Mega Man properties into all the different like Game Boy Advance Mega Mans and Mega Man Legends and stuff like that, which were very different sort of game styles. So I would say that if there is any rubric to use for what is and isn't a spiritual successor in kind of all forms, that series has kind of gone through the gamut of all of them, where it's like you had a former member making a game in the style of, you had the game studio itself releasing a new version of the game through the X series, and then releasing original versions of the game through 7 and 8, and then coming back to it with deep sequels later with 9 and 10, which were enjoyable to play. Certainly better than Mighty Number 9. And then so it's kind of an interesting thing where it's like that one series has sort of hit almost all of the notes of Mega Man, of spiritual succession and like deep releases to throw back to something that we loved nostalgically in a weird way, just in one property.
Well, yeah, but it also has hit the, like, so many fans have tried to remake it, and so many fans have tried to, having nothing to do with the original games, tried to make the next spiritual successor. An excellent game that's super underrated that is very, very much feels like Mega Man with a roguelike mechanic, 2000XX.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic, if you haven't played it, pick it up on Steam. It's a multiplayer roguelike, but feels 100% and plays 100% like Mega Man X. And it is an absolute blast. I played it all the way. I played it through with my brother. Every time is a new run, so you actually have to beat the bosses in one life. The thing is, there are no instant pitfall deaths. That's how they kind of fix that, is that when you fall, you kind of your robot buddy pulls you out and you just take a bunch of damage. But it was 2000XX was what I wanted Mighty Number 9 to be, with a roguelike mechanic tacked on. And yeah, you're right. Mega Man has just gone through all those different facets. And I do think, though, that like fans who have nothing to do with the original work can make amazing spiritual successors, especially when you can see that these people have loved and obsessed over this thing.
Absolutely. That leads into I was thinking, and I put a lot of thought onto why we're getting so many of them right now. And we talked about this 2 weeks ago in this kind of super era of like deep sequel and hyper nostalgia, like why we're into it right now. And number one, I think, is its access. There is the various game engines that you can get relatively on the cheap, so independent fans can make a play to try to make these successor stories that they grew up and loved, and just kind of want to recreate that. Maybe don't see many of those games in the market anymore. There's also, I think, an aspect where it's like mechanically, because you can get your game kickstarted, or you can make a game relatively on the cheap, especially if it's a throwback to a 16-bit or a 32-bit era game, because of like Unreal 4's like independent license and various other game engines. it's really interesting to me now to see that, and because of places like Steam where it's easy to post your game up, or easier to post your game up, and mobile device games, that we're in an age where it's so easy to pursue that, where it's like 10, 15, certainly 15 years ago, but even 10 years ago, it would have been super hard for nobody related to any proper studio being like, I'm going to make a spiritual successor to, I'm going to make Bloodstained, right? Like they couldn't have easily done it without going through a publisher. Even if they have a big crew, they'd have to still go through the money gates to really make it. And so it made me realize, I'm like, well, that's why we're seeing it so much now. Are we going to continue seeing it? And if you had to pick, Ron, what would be the kinds of games that released within the last 10, 12 years that you think have sort of almost instantly fallen off the mark, that were like unique games that we'll see in another 10 years being spiritually successed, if you will?
Oh, that's a good question.
That's a toughie. It's a toughie. I thought about it a lot.
Oh, man. I'm not thinking of anything really quick right off the top of my head, and that is terrible for podcasting, which would be dead air. So what did you get? What did you come up with?
I have a couple. I think that eventually Minecraft will kind of not so much fall out of fashion as just the interest will be gone for it. The developers, Microsoft will release too many things that don't work for it, and it will fall off. I think what we're primed for is spiritual successors to MMOs. Final Fantasy XIV is still firing on a lot of cylinders, but the era of like when World of Warcraft came out and EverQuest 2 came out and Guild Wars came out and everything like that, that era kind of wrapped itself up in the single-digit aughts, right? And there's been a handful of like few and far between successes, but we didn't have the marketplace for it. And I think now, especially with streaming gaming, like servers, gaming as a service, sort of streamed on servers, I think that's going to open up MMOs to become something, and then there will inevitably be a spiritual successor to that era of MMO. World of Warcraft is still plenty popular. Again, Final Fantasy XIV is shockingly popular still. And Guild Wars 2 even still has a fair subscription group, but or active player group. But there's been a disinterest, and it's because people haven't been able to figure out what creature comforts to put in the game and what little tweaks to bring them forward. And so I think MMOs, but I also think Minecraft, is that we'll see Minecraft kind of fall off, and in about 10 years from now, someone will make something where you basically build virtual Legos, and you get to build your virtual world. And it won't be exactly the same at Minecraft, but it'll feel a lot like it felt like when people were playing Minecraft for the first time or in the early eras of Minecraft, and people will be like, this is amazing, this is what I want. So I think those are like the two prime kind of categories of games that when we're in our late 40s still doing this podcast, we can review this episode and be like oh yeah, that did actually happen. Globe of globe of war is basically World of Warcraft, but like with a lot of creature comforts. Also, I think VR is going to give us a lot of spiritual successors when it eventually gets all the way there and people get used to gaming in it. I think VR will give us a bunch of spiritual successors because it's a new way to interface.
There's a new Half-Life game.
Yeah, that's a VR game. I don't consider it a real Half-Life game because it's honestly not actually that good. But it is a new Half-Life game, and it happened because of virtual reality. It would not have come out as just a standard first-person shooter. So I think we're gonna see it with gaming as a service, streaming services, and VR. I think we're gonna see a lot of interesting things over the next decade or so of gaming, probably through to 2030.
I think I got one. And this one might be a little risky because I'm not 100% sure. But I think we might see a resurgence here in the next like 10 years of what we eventually titled walking simulators. Really amazing, story driven, not a lot of action, just walking from point A to point B, clicking on things, like Gone Home or shoot, there's a ton of them. The Vanishing of Ethan Carter, games like that. I think that is right now kind of on a downswing, and I have a feeling there will be a market for short story driven content like that again. But I know a lot of people kind of got burnt out on walking simulators because every indie kid with a story to tell made a damn walking simulator.
Oh yeah,
yeah. But I just wanted to point out one we haven't mentioned, and I think it's criminal that we haven't, is one that shows just how much one guy who loves the shit out of a property can make an amazing spiritual successor. Stardew Valley.
Oh yeah.
They still make Harvest Moon games. I don't know if they've made a great Harvest Moon game in any recent years, but man, did that one guy, Concerned Dave, make a really great Harvest Moon game.
Yeah, that was a great example of it's like, what if Harvest Moon, but like with now computers instead of then computers? Like what if Harvest Moon, but I can go a ton of directions with it instead of a handful of directions with it, and really flesh out the depth of what this game could have been. That's a great game. We also didn't mention any of the things that really almost they brought back. They almost brought it back, and then the studio closed. And then some of them have been bought, so we'll see some things. But Telltale, speaking of like walking around and clicking on things, Telltale basically being like, no one does point and click adventure games anymore. What if we did it? And then they made some passes at it and sort of like refined what people wanted, which is just basically a choice-based quick time event book that they got to watch, or comic book that they got to play, essentially. They really knocked it out of the park for several games. And then, of course, business reasons and overtaxing their workers and trying to do too much too soon shut them down as a studio. But it's like, those were Monkey Island's next step. And if you go back and you play the pre-Walking Dead ones, like Sam and Max and Jurassic Park and Back to the Future, you can very much see that they're pulling like a lot more from that era. And that Walking Dead was sort of them finally coming to figure out, it's like, okay, but like, what do people not actually like about that anymore? What were things that they put in those games that are no longer appealing to an audience in large, or just were never really that great? They were just a way to add some challenge to the game, but ended up being filler. And so there's not as much walking back and forth. There's not as much like deep concentration, looking at the screen, trying to figure out what the fuck you were supposed to do kind of thing. Is a much more casual experience that lets you kind of pick the narrative. And so I feel like those will come back along with the walk and click games, more in the style of Gone Home, and we'll see a lot more of those. And again, virtual reality will punch those way the shit up, because you don't have to be that active in them, so you can just sort of enjoy experiencing the world. And being like, oh, look at this, look over here, look at how cool this is, the sky looks really great.
Well, I think Telltale actually helped pave the way for a spiritual successor to a game that absolutely influenced their style by the guys who did that game. Now, Maniac Mansion's creators did Thimbleweed Park recently.
Yeah.
And Thimbleweed Park is awesome. Like, it is meta, it is hilarious, it is a lot of fun. It feels kind of like X-Files meets Twin Peaks. It's this, it's a point-and-click adventure game in the most classic of styles, but I don't think without Telltale's putting out all these point-and-click adventure games, there would have been as big of a market for people being like, whoa, like, these are the guys that inspired the Telltale guys, and they're making the game? Yeah. That could be cool. And sure enough,
it ended up being good.
It's so good. It was one of those random pickups I got on the Xbox Game Pass for PC. I was just like, Thimbleweed Park? Yeah, I'll check it out. Somebody said it's kind of like Twin Peaks. Finished it in a couple sittings. Loved it. Well, that's about all the time we got for today's episode. Before we go, though, let's get some plugs in. What's going on over at Dying of Exposure?
Well, Dying of Exposure now has its schedule up that hopefully I will adhere to about releasing over on the website about when content releases. We have the Twitch series Through the Mill, which is a homebrew D&D 5th Ed Western Plains Desert Fantasy RPG run by me with a number of other Dying of Exposure contributors that airs live on Twitch at 7:30 p.m. on Tuesdays Pacific time, and then goes over, I put the episodes over on the YouTube every Friday. And then I also, for people that don't want spiritual successors and just want nostalgia, Thursdays at usually around noon, and by usually I mean I try to hit noon exactly, for 2 hours, noon every Thursday on Twitch, and then again over on Facebook. A couple days later, you can watch me stream classic RPGs on Twitch as well. I've started with Chrono Trigger, and so I play it for a couple hours every Thursday. I talk to the audience there. I love Chrono Trigger, and I will be going through nothing but classic JRPGs for the foreseeable future, because they're what really turned me from a kid that sometimes played as Nintendo to a kid that played video games every day. And so that's what I will be doing. What should people be looking into for you, Ron?
Well, head on over to Leota Role-Playing on Facebook. So it's facebook.com/Leota Role-Playing. And of course, all the fun stuff you can check out with the podcast here. Anytime you want, you can head over to the website, therolesweplay.podbean.com or facebook.com/therolesweplay. And we always like having conversations with folks. So if you got some comments on the episodes or some things you'd like to see, or hell, something you'd like us to talk about, we're all ears, because we're just going to keep coming up with nerdy gaming stuff to talk about until you tell us you want something a little different. And then maybe we'll talk about that. Maybe finally do that Pornhub episode we promised.
Oh, that Pornhub episode. I've got a lot to talk about with Pornhub. I spent a lot of time on it. I that's what my Android phone is like 80% for, is Pornhub. Yeah. Also, we're not all ears. We only have 3 ears between the two of us, Ron. I do not have a right ear, so do not at me with wanting 4 ears when all you can get is 3. I don't know why someone's like, listen to me with all 4 of your collective ears. And I'd be like, I can't. And then they'd be like, well, you failed the check on perception then. I've been playing a lot of D&D recently. Anyway, yeah. So please comment, like, subscribe, follow the podcast at the Podbean site. That's where you should be following it. If you want to look at us, follow us at Dying of Exposure on social media, but more importantly on the YouTube, with Dying of Exposure as the channel name.
All right, well, that's all we got for today. In a couple weeks, we're going to be talking about something that's not Nostalgia Goggles. We'll have some brand new content for you. Probably be back on the Skype format again, just for that one, to be on the safe side. We want to do the responsible social distancing. And all right, there we go. That's the show. I'm Ron, for Steve and the Roles We Play. I'll play myself out.